Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this day in history, our nightly look back at a particular day in history where we examine the day, why it's important, and the historical context of those events. And we're going to cover several things today that I find to be incredibly interesting. A note, we're not going to cover MLK Day today because it's not always on January the 20th. January 20th is one of the latest days that it can occur. The latest date that it can occur is the 21st, and the earliest is January 15th. So, we're not going to be covering that, but I've got several interesting topics for you that we're going to cover tonight. So, let's get started with this day in history, January 20th. When the 20th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted and ratified, it changed the date in which a presidential term began and ended. Prior to 1937, presidential terms had begun and ended on March the 4th, as did Congress. The 20th Amendment changed that. And it also changed when the Electoral College was counted, changed when the congressional term begun and ended. But the big thing for our purposes is we're going to focus on the Inauguration Day of Presidents every 4 years. So, in between the election of President Franklin Roosevelt and the end of Herbert Hoover's term, the Great Depression went from bad to worse. This country was on the edge of a revolution. And it was about a 5-month span. And in that 5-month span, you had an attempt on Roosevelt's life. He was almost assassinated. It's a miracle he survived, really, and wasn't hit, or even worse. So, Congress at this point was already debating changing it just because of the radical, on-edge nature of a nation. And it moved it up. Prior to this time, they were on this, it took a while to get from wherever to become president, and they needed to get with modern times. It did not take as long for someone to get to Washington, D.C. So, beginning in 1937, presidential inauguration days every 4 years occur on January 20th. So, every regular scheduled presidential inauguration since has occurred on that day. And if it falls on a Sunday, they have the swearing in private, and then on Monday the 21st, they have a public ceremony. But presidential terms begin and end every 4 years on January 20th. So next year on this day, we will have a presidential inauguration. We will either be inaugurating the 46th President of the United States for their first term, or Donald Trump will take the oath of office for his second and final term as president. Reagan's, Nixon, JFK, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama's first term, George W. Bush, Nixon, Eisenhower, Truman, a regular scheduled inauguration, Roosevelt's second, third, and fourth inauguration all occurred on this day. Reagan's second inauguration had a private swearing in on this day, as did Obama's second in 2013. Just ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That was 59 years ago today. Government isn't the solution to problems. Government is the problem. That was 39 years ago today. So, some births that occurred on this day. In 1896, in New York City, a man by the name of George Burns was born. George Burns was an entertainer that was active from 1902 to 1996, just a few weeks before his death. He is one of the few actors that spanned from vaudeville to film to television, radio. He hit them all. The only thing he didn't hit was the internet and YouTube. And if he had lived long enough, he would have been a master at that. Just an incredibly funny guy, known in his later life for some oversized glasses that he wore. I mean, they were huge. They were the size of Coke bottles, essentially. He died when I was very young, but I bought some sunglasses when I was little that were just huge things. I mean, they look goofy on my little face. And somebody said I look like George Burns. And I have read that on his 100th birthday, George Burns was asked what he wanted for his 100th birthday, and he quipped, "A night with Sharon Stone." So even to the end, he had a great sense of humor. So, born on this day in 1896, George Burns. Some deaths that have occurred on this day. Now, this one is the one I'm really wanting to touch on. George V died on this day in 1936 at Sandringham House in Norfolk, England. He was the king from 1910 to 1936. He was 70. His death really triggered a chain of events that still shapes the monarchy to this day. When he died, his oldest son, obviously, became king, Edward the Eighth. And the son and the father had a strained relationship because Edward wasn't getting his stuff together. And he was commiserating with a divorced American. And at the time, this was a huge headache for the royals. And before he died, the king had said that Edward would ruin the crown in about 12 months. He doted on his son Albert and his daughter Princess Elizabeth. 326 days after the king's death, Edward abdicated the throne. He chose love over the crown, and when he abdicated, Albert became King George VI. He took the name of his father as his regal name, and he served as king during World War II. And when he died, his eldest daughter, Queen Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth. And this was as King George V had hoped, because he doted over Queen Elizabeth when she was younger, and hoped that nothing would stand in the way of her father eventually becoming, king, and then her becoming queen. And so, because of the events that occurred on this day, and Edward's inability to find an appropriate match. The current queen that sits today, the the gears were set in motion with the death of George the Fifth. The George the Fifth served at a very consequential time. As king, he saw the rise of socialism, communism, fascism. He saw the outbreak of the world wars. I mean, the man saw many troubling things. He saw in World War One almost all the other monarchs in Europe fall, many of whom were related to him. Um, so he is a very consequential figure in world history. And he died at 70 on this day in 1936. So, yeah. Couple of things. Impeachment wrap up will be on Friday of this week. We'll wrap up what's occurred to that point, and I know they're convening on Saturday, so Saturday, whatever happens from Saturday to Friday, will be covered the next week, if it even lasts that long, because apparently Mitch McConnell's trying to do a quickie impeachment. We're going to also do Iowa videos, not next week, but the next, and all sorts of other fun stuff. So I will see you all then. Y'all have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow.